Welcome to the Gamers Tavern, episode 11. We kinda knew that this topic was going to be a big one, but I don't really think either Ross nor I understood exactly how big until we finished recording. The finished episode with the raw edit ended up over 3 hours long. So, what topic could Ross and I possibly talk about for longer than even we talked about Shadowrun? Why, of course it would be nothing less than the father of modern role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons. Next month marks the 40th anniversary of the first printing of the original boxed set for D&D by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, also known as the White Box. To honor this game, we wanted to talk about the origins of the system, from its roots in wargaming to chainmail through basic 1st and 2nd edition AD&D. We're talking about the inception and refinement of the biggest thing that's ever happened in tabletop gaming. And if you're curious about 3rd edition, 3.5, 4th edition, Pathfinder, the old school Renaissance, D&D Next, and what's going to happen in the future of D&D, I unfortunately have to point you to a future episode. Because this was so long, we actually split this into 2 parts. So it's our first 2-part episode here at the Gamers Tavern, and I'm really thrilled about that. Yeah, we rambled so long on this topic, we're making it 2 parts. So go ahead and grab a drink from the bar, sit down at the table in the corner, and we'll be right back after this word from our sponsor. Have you checked out Audible yet? It's the biggest repository for audiobooks on the internet with over 100,000 different books. Do you want to check out the Dresden Files series I keep harping about? Or maybe you want to read Game of Thrones so that the TV series can't spoil you anymore? Or do you want to revisit those old classic Dragonlance and Drizzt novels you grew up on? Audible has them all. If you click on the link at gamerstavern.org, you can get a special 30-day free trial of Audible that includes a credit toward a free book. A subscription is only $14.95 afterwards, and if you know that Audible is going to be for you, like I do, you can sign up right away and get your first 3 months at half off. What happens if you get a membership? Well, you get 30% off of every purchase, plus exclusive membership deals and a free subscription to either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Ready to get started with your Audible experience? Go to gamerstavern.org and click on the Audible link to get started now.
Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Gamers Tavern. I'm Ross Watson.
And I'm Darryl Mott Jr.
And tonight we are talking about a granddaddy of the tabletop RPG. We are talking about the Dungeons & Dragons RPG.
And the additions throughout that's gotten released. All the various versions that you've played over the years.
Exactly. So it's a really big
bitched
topic.
about online constantly.
It's a really big topic, so actually there's no guests tonight, it's just the 2 of us. But before we get into the meat of all that, we need to kind of cover a little bit of ground, because whenever you bring up Dungeons & Dragons, especially recently, and whenever you bring up different editions of Dungeons & Dragons, the first thing you kind of have to address is the issue of edition wars.
Or flame wars.
Well, hopefully not flame wars. Let's just get one thing straight. There's no hate on this podcast. We're just going to talk about things from our own perspective through the lenses of our own experiences. Your opinion is your opinion, and we're not going to try and say anything's objectively wrong or bad.
Yeah, I have my preference for which edition of D&D I prefer, and that includes Pathfinder and all the OSR and everything else. I appreciate every single edition I have read for its strengths and its weaknesses. I love them all for their own reasons. I can pick a favorite child, but I still love them all equally.
Right. So we're just going to kind of, try and nip that edition war stuff in the bud. We're going to say some things that Darryl and I already agree to. So when we say these things, it's something we definitely believe. And number one, we believe that every system, every edition of Dungeons & Dragons included, has its strengths and weaknesses on a mechanical level. They all are not perfect, and they are all not terrible.
And every edition, thanks to the mechanics and the way they're played out, have their own tone and feel based on how the mechanics affect your ability to tell a story in the system.
The key thing here is you, our listeners, you should play the system you like the best, and don't take what anybody else says, especially what we say, as trying to stop you from playing something you enjoy.
Exactly.
So we are going to just talk about Dungeons & Dragons and kind of briefly kind of go over some of the things that make these things special to us. And I think we should probably start with the basic set, because that's the kind of origins of Dungeons & Dragons.
1974. The original box set was released.
Yeah, which is a year before I was born. So there you go.
And 6 years before I was born, so you'll understand why I'm a little bit hazy on the first couple editions here.
And, I think neither one of us is like a super scholar on like the origins of Dungeons & Dragons, but we have talked to some people who know things, and if you want like a really comprehensive breakdown, I would urge you to check out Shannon Appleklein's book, Designers of Dragons. But we will say what we know to be true, and of course there's Wikipedia if you want to hit up some even more of these bullet points. But so
and I'm going to make sure to include in the show notes the many links to the history of Dungeons & Dragons, so you can always read more on your own time.
So something that's really important to note, Dungeons & Dragons was actually originally a tabletop miniature war game rule set.
Chainmail.
That's right. And basically, Gary Gygax and his friends said, wouldn't it be interesting to, since they had armies of like elves and guys on horseback knights, things like that. Wouldn't it be kind of cool if we had rules for just like a small band of these guys, kind of like the Fellowship of the Ring, Well,
it was pretty much Dave Arneson that came up with the idea of doing one player, one character. He was doing that in his Napoleonic war games that he was using the chainmail rules for. And that's how Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson met up.
So
was through mutual friends. Yeah,
just to kind of, put this into perspective, this was a period of time where games, particularly hobby games and particularly war games, were very complex and the rules were very granular. This was the early days of kind of understanding how, these kind of games work. So there was a style that pretty much everyone kind of accepted. It was the very, crunchy rule sets.
Yeah, you hear me joke all the time on here about Hero System and Rifts and everything else. No, these games had nothing on the old school war games. Even Avalon Hill stuff is simple compared to the old, 50s and 60s war games that were coming out.
You know what, and what's interesting, just even to take a little side trip on that, how over time, role players, we've seen, things kind of come and go, and we've seen things like the card games kind of push into our territory, and you hear a lot of role players, at the time going, oh, those darn card gamers, they were kind of taking over our game stores, grumble, grumble, grumble. What was funny is what was happening right after Dungeons & Dragons got big was that the war gamers, the old school war gamers, they were saying the same thing about role-playing. They're like, role-playing's taking over our game stores where we used to just play our little war games all the time. What's going on?
And I really want to point out here that when we're talking about war gamers, we're not talking about like Warhammer 40K with the awesome painted minis and anything. We're talking about these guys would buy literally envelopes with cardboard punch-out chits on hex paper that was tiny. And these guys would spend hours poring over these things and running all these military simulations.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm sure those games are really fun.
Oh, I played many of them. They're fascinating as hell. They are really hard to understand if you don't know what you're doing or you don't have a good teacher, but they are a blast to play.
And some of them probably were miniature gamers, but I would agree with you that the majority at this time when we're talking about war gamers, the majority are the guys who use the little chits and things like that.
Yeah, miniature wargaming was just starting up when Chainmail came out.
Yeah.
And that's what Chainmail's big thing was. It had rules for using your actual 15mm painted Napoleonic miniatures in war games. And then they moved into medieval stuff, which brought us to...
the basic set, right?
Exactly.
And, what's funny, I've seen a friend of mine bought a copy of the original white box set, and I think it's being re-released really soon, isn't it?
It's coming out this month. It's actually on... I tried to get it on Quint's holiday list for this year, but he neglected to put it on. But it's coming out. It's either, by the time you hear this podcast, it will be out. It's like $150, something like that. I'll put a link in the show notes to it, but it's a complete reprint of the first 6 booklets that came out.
Right.
and it's in a very, very nice carved wooden box and everything. It is gorgeous, and
I'm planning on getting a copy for sure.
I would love to get a copy. I have no desire whatsoever to try to play those rules, but the history and the craftsmanship and the collectability of that set, I want it so bad because it looks so gorgeous. But that's one of the things I wanted to bring up about the not the BX and BECMI, but the original basic rulebook was, it was written for people who had experience in war games. So
Yes.
the rules were very hard to understand if you weren't already a gamer.
You know, I got to be honest with you. I've never played the white box set. The very first edition I ever played was the red box by Metzner, which is one of the base.
That was BX, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and God, you're really taking me back here because it's been a long. You know, we're talking 30 years ago. So.
Yeah, was it Metzner or Molde that did the?
Molde,
one of them did BX, and then one of them did BECMI.
See, this is where my lack of
remember
expertise kind of hurts me on this. Is I honestly don't remember which was which. But there was 2 red box sets. I had both of them, and one of them had the Errol Otis cover, and one had the Elmore cover. But anyway, that's really where I got started playing was in that particular basic set period. And I really liked it. You know, we've talked a little bit before about, like, you know, the Caves of Chaos and Alina and Bargle, and all that is from that basic set.
Mm-hmm.
And Keep on the Borderlands and In Search of the Unknown. You remember that module?
Oh yeah, I've actually been trying to work on a conversion of that to update that to the new playtest edition, which we'll get into later. But I've been working on that and a first edition module that we're going to talk about later, which is Temple of Elemental Evil.
If it's okay with you, I'd actually like to talk a little bit about In Search of the Unknown.
Oh, please do. It is the second best introductory adventure behind Keep on the Borderlands.
Well, here's the thing about In Search of the Unknown. It is a classic. I love it. I think, for me, I enjoyed the hell out of it. Looking back on it now, though, I think it encourages a particular style of play, and I think that the people who bought and used In Search of the Unknown, like myself, you know, kind of took our cue from that as this is how you're supposed to play D&D, that it is pretty much all about the dungeon crawls and figuring out, you know, the mystery behind the dungeon and having those kind of weird random things like the room full of pools. and those are all cool. But for me, for many, many years, that's that's what I thought D&D was. You know, I didn't really understand quite all the cool things you can do from a role-playing, storytelling, character immersion point of view. And I think unfortunately, kind of the downside or the flaw to In Search of the Unknown, because otherwise it is a really great, I love the backstory to it.
Yeah, it is a brilliant dungeon crawl adventure. It is not the sandbox that Keep on the Borderlands was.
Right.
That involved a lot more elements where it was a lot more fill in the blank compared to, there were, Keep on the Borderlands became the classic module because that's the one that almost everyone who bought the red box got B2, Keep on the Borderlands, in that red box.
Yeah, yeah.
And the earlier editions had Into the Unknown, and that was also one of the first introductory adventures that they had written for Dungeons and Dragons at the time.
Yep.
And it was 2 different approaches to how to introduce someone to the game.
Yep.
Keep on the Borderlands is really more of a tool for DMs to kind of
Yeah.
put their own mark on a campaign, and was trying to encourage you to create your own thing, because it was more along the lines of, here's the keep. Here's what all the little buildings in the keep are. Here's the Caves of Chaos. Here's what lives in the Caves of Chaos. Have fun.
Yeah. And you're
and
right.
It was up to you to create the stories.
It was. And here's the thing is, like, when my young 8-year-old mind, when I was looking at this stuff, I just couldn't grasp the Keep on the Borderlands, unfortunately. And I was teaching myself. I didn't have anyone to really show me what it was supposed to be about.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's kind of why I fell into and embraced wholeheartedly the In Search of the Unknown approach. Because that was something I could, you know, my young mind was like, oh, okay, I get this. You know, this is what it's supposed to be about. So you could say my earliest memories of Dungeons & Dragons, especially the basic set, are all around dungeon crawls, pretty much like all dungeon crawls all the time. And I just wanted to make that clear, you know, up front.
Yeah, and a lot of those first adventures that came out for basic D&D were very dungeon crawl adventures, including probably one of the most iconic, and it was an adventure path before that became a thing, which was the giants leading to the Drow in the Underdark.
Yeah.
Which led to the battling Lolth.
Yeah, that was I forget what that's called, but Against the Giants is the first one in that set.
Yeah, against the giant. Crap, I can't remember the whole sequence, but it was all collected in Queen of the Spiders,
and it is fantastic. It is such a portal into Gary's mind. That's the thing I love about it, is you kind of see all the crazy little sort of fun, creative trips that his mind was taking when he was designing things for Dungeons & Dragons, because there's still elements of that adventure line that I think are just unspeakably epic.
And it really spoke to a specific style of adventure writing that is completely lost in this day and age, which I'm honestly am not sure is a bad thing per se. But
it is a product of its times.
It is a product of its time.
But there's parts that still make me say, "Wow!" I mean, there's that vampire's castle with the hallway with doors that open to other worlds. Remember that?
Not off the top of my head.
Oh my god, it's so amazing. It's in one of the later adventures, but you find this castle.
I only really went through D1 and D2. Like I said, I'm 33 years old, so I'm a little bit on the young side for a lot of these first edition stuff, but I got into the big nostalgia thing, and I ran conversions of these in Pathfinder for D1 and D2, but again, we'll get to Pathfinder later on in the podcast. But one thing I really wanted to touch on was a lot of these early edition books were written in a specific way that is very hard for a modern gamer to grasp, but there's actually a story going on, because it isn't spoon-fed to a DM when they're reading the module. It is, as they're getting to every single room, they'll find a scrap of paper from so-and-so that says this, and it leads one chain to another, and you have to uncover it the same way your players would uncover it as they're exploring the dungeon. It's not, here's the big long text of what the adventure's going to be, now just here's what's in every single room.
It's more of like an excuse to show really cool stuff, little packets of encounters that are meant like, ooh, wow, this encounter is cool because of these things. But there isn't, it's a different approach. It's very unique.
And it's very, very, very subtle writing. You have to read every single page of every single one of those, which I can understand modern game design sensibilities have shifted away from that because reduced attention spans, everything else. But in the 70s and 80s, the hell else were you going to do? You put on your Led Zeppelin record and you sit there and read the adventure module 4 or 5 times in a row.
Well, yeah, and I got to be, completely honest with you, is that, the parts I remember are awesome because, my mind was, just really focusing on everything we did, right? But looking back on it now, like trying to imagine myself playing through it now, I don't think you would get a really good experience out of it without a lot of DM fiat, bringing in other things, different encounters for your characters to riff off of and get that role-playing, storytelling, character immersion bits.
Because a lot of those were really built around random encounter tables, and that's kind of where a lot of the stories for individual players came out, were through those random encounters. If you want to talk about random encounters, D1, the first Underdark adventure, I'm sorry, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but it was the first one. It's after you have gone through all the giants and you find out that the Drow were kind of rousing them up, and you're chasing them into the Underdark to go into the Drow city and all that. The D1 module is nothing but, here is a map of the Underdark and a bunch of tunnels. Here are some close-up maps of the various tunnels you can use. Here is a shitload of random encounters, and that was almost literally all the adventure was. It wasn't until you got to D2 where you met the Troglodyte city that any sort of actual linear plot started to develop.
And if you looked at my junior high school and grade school notebooks, you'd see tons of maps like this.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's what I was doing. I was like, I'm going to draw, I want to make a big-ass dungeon, and all these cool, bizarre, I wanted to do like a big Underdark Drow city. And this was all, it was sort of proto-world building and proto-encounter building, but it was more, it was almost entirely focused on the mechanics of combat and tactics and things like that. It really, very, very little having to do with story.
Which was kind of strange because the way the rules were written for Basic, which really changed when it shifted over to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, was Basic was really built around this concept of you already know how to run a game with wargames, especially in the earlier versions. The later versions, when they got tooled with some fixed a lot of these issues with BX and BECMI. Jesus Christ. But a lot of those got fixed with that, but in the earliest editions of the game, you're expected to know how to run a tabletop combat game on your own. The rules were really built around something that's become a buzzword recently, which is rulings over rules.
That's an interesting philosophy that we should probably define a little more.
Rulings over rules is the concept between how much should be prescribed by the game mechanics themselves and how much should be left to the DM's hands to figure out how to adjudicate. So, for example, and this is again skipping way ahead in the timeline, 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons was very, very, very much rules over rulings. You could almost run a DM-less game of 4th edition because the mechanics took care of themselves.
And the monsters were written with, like, per round actions. Like, they're going to do, first round they do this, second round they do this.
Exactly. And that's what rules over ruling is. The mechanics are so well defined and so well balanced that you don't have to interpret anything. The way I've always heard it described was in a scenario in a game. You're the thief. You see the scout from the enemy troops. You're standing on the top of the wall to the keep or whatever. And you look down and you see him. Okay, I'm going to jump off the roof and hold my sword down under me so that all my weight comes down on the sword and impales him with it. In a rules-based system, what the DM would then do is look up the rules for jumping, landing, weight, falling, crushing damage, so on and so forth, and doesn't have any sort of fiat to kind of shift things up and change things.
But isn't there always a rule zero? I mean, can't you always invoke the idea that the game master can...
And that's one of the misconceptions about 4th edition. Again, we'll get into that later. But the idea is that if you're going to play strictly by the rules, you have to look up the rules and blah, blah, blah. In rulings over rules, you say, okay, that's really cool. What happens is you do this and blah, blah, and you just... On the fly, the DM makes rules calls. And that's the big difference. The DM making a ruling versus the rules on the paper.
Okay, well, that's an interesting... That is a very interesting topic because it definitely can apply to a lot of different situations. I personally, as a GM, I like to be the guy who is who makes rulings and let the rules be, more of a guideline than an absolute sort of cage, so to speak. But that... But at the same time,
that's complete running style.
But at the same time, I enjoy a system greatly that has a lot of these things defined ahead of time. I enjoy the idea that I don't have to do it very often. I would, if it was for those rare circumstances where a player decides to do something cool and creative and fun, that's where I get excited and have a good time with it. But if I have to make stuff up for things that seem relatively simple or relatively why didn't they think of this? That's probably where I would say I'm not as big a fan of that particular approach.
Okay, and one thing we absolutely have to talk about while we're still on basic is all the side stuff that started coming out at this time. This was before Open Gaming License, before anything like that, but there were still... D&D kind of blew up the gaming world.
Yes, it did.
And there were all kinds of fanzines and magazines, both really limited run prints and big, huge, giant publications. Polyhedron, Dungeon, Dungeon magazine didn't even come in until way late in 1st edition, didn't it?
White Dwarf.
Yeah, White Dwarf. All these game magazines were publishing what was quote-unquote official content, which is something in this day and age of you must strictly enforce your IP would never happen. And it was kind of open gaming. There were companies that were licensing from TSR to publish these modules that are completely off the wall and different, including Games Workshop was publishing D&D material.
Yeah, they were. Games Workshop, believe it or not, published material for a ton of different games, including Traveler. But that's a conversation we can probably go back to in a different later show, because Games Workshop is a subject that would probably fill an entire show.
Oh, no question.
So, when we're talking about basic, you're talking about games that we should also mention that there were a lot of games that were a lot like D&D. RuneQuest, Tunnels and Trolls,
And I believe Talisman came out about the same time, didn't it? The first edition?
I don't know. Talisman's, in my opinion, Talisman's a little more board gamey, but
Hero
Quest certainly...
It built on those same things. Hero Quest didn't come out until way later. Hero Quest was my generation.
Oh, okay, if you're certain. So, I seem to recall
Hero Quest was 86, I believe.
Maybe I'm thinking of something else then.
80,
but there was
86, 87.
There were certainly board games that were aping Dungeons & Dragons. There was Dark Tower, of course.
And, of course, Dungeon from TSR.
And, of course, Dungeon, yes. But I'm going to skip a little ahead in the timeline, but I'm going to stay in Basic. Because Basic D&D hung around for a long time. There was basically two periods where I really, really enjoyed it. And Basic I really enjoyed when I first started playing, and Basic I enjoyed in the early 90s as well.
Role Cyclopedia?
Probably. All I know is that there was a bunch of titles that said Dungeons & Dragons on the cover. And okay. I believe this is still Basic. It was just sort of an advanced Basic,
For you kids out there, Basic Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons had a split in the late 70s, I want to say 78, 79, where that was the first edition of AD&D was published during this time, and it was also the first time that, I actually looked it up, Metzer published the first Basic D&D, and then Moldve came in later and did the BECMI, and BECMI was eventually booked into one thing and given some updates and errata and rules tweaks.
And was Rules Encyclopedia.
Rules, exactly.
But so in the 80s, I guess let's back up just a little bit. But in the 80s, there was a slew of material for Greyhawk that had come out.
Oh yeah.
And let's just briefly touch on Greyhawk and Blackmore. Blackmore was like the first. My understanding is it was the first campaign setting.
Yeah, Blackmore was the first campaign setting. That was what Dave Arneson started running before this was in 72, I want to say, is when he started that campaign, 72 or 73. And then that's when one of Dave and Gary's mutual friends drove Gary up to Dave Arneson's basement where he was running these games and showed him, and that's when D&D was formed, was when he saw what Arneson was doing with Blackmore, which was this sort of each person plays one thing. And Arneson is the one who came up with the idea of classes, levels, experience points, things like that. A lot of what we consider and I really have to bring this up. And I'm sorry to the Gary Gygax fans out there. Gary Gygax was a genius. He is a god among men. I do not mean to speak ill of the man, but to a lot of people, and I'm not going to say whether I'm one of those or not, but I think it's kind of obvious from the way I'm talking that I am, there is an idea that Gary Gygax is to Dave Arneson as Stan Lee is to Jack Kirby.
Well, and I think that's not a terrible analogy just because both men, Stan Lee and Gary Gygax, both men went through several phases of their life. I mean, if you look at 1960s Stan Lee versus 1990s Stan Lee versus 2011 Stan Lee, right? They're different people.
Yes.
People change. Stan has certainly changed. I believe that Gary changed. I believe that Gary went through periods of time where Gary's attitude specifically was not good for the gaming industry. But there were times when Gary was its leading and most prominent cheerleader and spokesman. And there were times when Gary, did some wonderful things for gaming. So I think, in terms of the man's overall lifetime, I think there's, you could sort of talk about it in different phases, right?
Like I said, there's no question that Gary Gygax is one of the patron saints of gaming total.
Yeah. And I,
you put him up with the guy who developed Monopoly in terms of tabletop gaming in general.
So, just to be aware that there is some kind of controversy about the contributions.
I'm an Arneson fan. That's all I'm going to say about. I'll probably say something else about that later on, but I love Gary Gygax. Gary Gygax is awesome. Some of his adventures, like I mentioned, many of them already, are some of my favorites ever written. But in terms of who came up with gaming, a lot of the core concepts were actually developed by Dave Arneson, and Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax together refined them into Dungeons and Dragons.
So let's just say that we admire and respect both men. I think we can agree to that.
Exactly.
Okay, we admire and respect both men. So Blackmore, as I was saying, was the first sort of campaign setting for Dungeons & Dragons. And unfortunately, I would have to say Blackmore is kind of fallen by the wayside. It's really only, a very few people in terms of a small percentage of gamers these days really
even know it existed.
Yeah, really kind of understand what it was.
It got pushed way to the side.
Yeah.
It was, and to be honest, as much as I love Dave Arneson, like I said, I worship both men as patron saints of gaming. My particular temple to Dave Arneson may be a little bit bigger than my one to Gygax, but that's my personal opinion. But Blackmore didn't really grip me nearly as much as Greyhawk did, which Greyhawk was, of course, Gary Gygax's baby.
Yeah, and I will say this, I thought Greyhawk, and I'm kind of with you on this, is what little I do know of Blackmore just doesn't excite me very much. I mean, I'm saying this, with all respect to the man, Dave Arneson. I'm sure that if he were running the game, I would probably love it a lot more. But just from looking at it, from an outsider's perspective, Greyhawk lit my imagination on fire in a lot of ways where I don't think Blackmore just really did. Of course, some of this was due to not just Gary, though, because Gary, there were a lot of cool things in Greyhawk that did come from Gary. But in the 80s, there was some really great gazetteers that came out for Greyhawk. Mm-hmm. And they were written by some really fantastic authors like Aaron Alston. And they really built up the world of Greyhawk. There was, the caliphates of all these, I can't remember the titles, but there was one about dwarves, there was one about shadow elves, there was one about, this sort of,
and you can get this even if you read just the quote unquote big modules for Greyhawk, for example, Village of Hamlet, T1, the intro to Temple of Elemental Evil, which is, come on, admit it, pretty much the quintessential dungeon crawl adventure.
It is, yeah, absolutely, I agree. So yeah, there's just,
even when you read that, you can just see there was so much going on in that world where all you're doing is your characters are playing this one little piece of the pie, and you get this feeling of a big, huge giant. There's more going on in this world than you can possibly imagine, and that's where the MI part of the BECMI came in, which is when you started getting those world-shattering
isn't that stand for, Masters and Immortals?
Exactly.
Yeah. And, just to close out, I think, I'm going to basically stop talking about BASIC here because there isn't much more I can really say.
Yeah.
But there's one campaign setting that is my absolute favorite for BASIC setting, and it's a setting that was really only one little booklet and a packet of 4 other booklets. So it's like a mini setting. It's basically just one little.
To kind of break it, the original Greyhawk and Blackmore were just these 32 book saddle stapled.
Yeah, I'm saying this one though is even less. I mean, there's probably more material for Blackmore than there is for this setting, but it was called Thunder Rift, and it came out in 1992, so it's a very latecomer to BASIC. But it was written by Colin McComb. Colin I've interviewed him on my blog. He's a fantastic writer. He's one of the minds behind Planescape Torment. He worked on Fallout.
Oh, okay, that's where I know that name.
Yeah,
okay.
Colin McComb is also Birthright. He's one of the minds behind Birthright, which is another of my favorite settings we will talk about later.
I was about to say, we're not going to talk about Birthright whatsoever at all when we get second edition, are we?
So it's fair to say, Thunder Rift, though, what I think is beautiful about Thunder Rift is in just a small booklet, Colin packs just tons and tons of adventure seeds, and whenever I read Thunder Rift and sit down and just kind of, flip through that little booklet, I immediately think I could run an entire campaign here in this setting without a problem. So I'll kind of stop there because there's some other books that came out for Thunder Rift after the core book, but none of them are by Colin, and they're all. I can't really recommend any of them as being
iffy quality.
Let's just say none of them expanded my mind quite as much as the core book, because there's no hate.
So let's go ahead and move forward to the split between basic and advanced D&D. Which one thing I want to get into is
one last thing. Just so you know, now we're going to move away from basic D&D. But if anybody ever asks you how you can tell if something is basic D&D, the easy answer is elf a class?
Or dwarf, depending on
elf, dwarf, and halfling.
I watch a lot of Dungeon Bastard, so
if any of those races are actually classes.
There were no race class splits. If you were
That's
you
basic.
are a fighter, magic user, or thief. I'm sorry, fighting man, magic user, or thief, elf, halfling, dwarf. Those were the classes / races.
And you were
There
kind of
was
dumb
no-
if you weren't an elf. I mean, it was like the obvious good choice. You know?
Oh, elves were so broken.
They were
early on.
Let's just
Even in AD&D, they were broken as hell. Which again,
let's talk about ADD now. So advanced.
Now, the reason why there was a split between the two, for the record, as far as I've been able to research it, is because of, like I was saying, that kind of split between rules versus rulings. Gary Gygax really wanted to push D&D toward rules. And the idea behind basic and advanced wasn't supposed to be, okay, you start off in basic and then you move to advanced like you might expect. It was more along the lines of, basic is more, here's a framework and your DM is going to have to fill in a lot of the blanks and make a lot of audible calls, to pull in a sports metaphor for some reason. And advanced was a lot more prescribed actions. It was a lot more rules. It was a lot more dense in terms of how things were going on, not just in combat, because again, these guys came from wargaming where everything was rules based, but a lot more social and interact. Everything had a rule for it.
Well, this is where we started seeing rules that weren't just combat, though, either. That we started seeing things like non-weapon proficiencies. And it really started to give you a structure and a verisimilitude for things that you did that weren't just dungeon crawling. You know,
like I said, that quintessential example of the thief standing on top of the wall, him jumping down. There's now a non-weapon proficiency, wall climbing and jump skill. You roll your percentage based on the table for the thief over whether or not he can climb the wall or whether or not he can jump.
Well, I think for me, like I started playing an awful lot of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons very early on, and that's partially because of the title. I mean, I was a smart kid. I considered my friends smart, and I said we should be playing Advanced. Why are we playing basic? We need to play Advanced. But seriously, I think Advanced is actually the first time that the books started speaking to me about the game taking place not just in a dungeon. They started talking about having adventures in cities. They started talking about,
wilderness. There was a lot of wilderness.
And building your keeps and things like that. There was just a little more, for me, first edition D&D is where it started to really open up the game beyond just, we're going to go kick in the door and kill some orcs. We're going to actually, have more story with it. And part of that is because I was just a huge reader at the time. And the Dragonlance books had come out.
Oh.
And Dragonlance,
that's something we should really talk about, are the novels that started coming out in first edition. But we'll get to that in a moment.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of Gary Gygax books from Greyhawk that I still actually really enjoy. Gord the Rogue is one of those.
And the Elminster books, of course.
Well, Elminster is kind of more second edition, I think, than first. But specifically, I'm thinking like because there were these Choose Your Own Adventure books.
Not Elminster, shit. Who's the other one? Because Elminster was
Forgotten Realms.
Yeah, and then there was the Greyhawk version of Elminster, almost.
Well, there's a bunch of powerful wizards in Greyhawk. I mean, I don't even want to try and...
One of the Triumvirate who used to, in Dungeon Magazine or Dragon Magazine, have their conversations where they would meet up on this alternate plane, which is where the parody adventure Castle Greyhawk came from, was that apparently he was this wizard whose name escapes me.
It's not Mordenkainen, is it?
Yes! Mordenkainen.
Okay, so Mordenkainen.
He was apparently
really
a movie producer
name
on our Earth, according to the Castle Greyhawk adventure.
It's a really great name for a wizard, I just want to point that out.
No question about
that.
But
there were these Choose Your Own Adventure books that were, they were written by Rose Estes. I honestly can't remember the titles of them, but there were quite a few of those that I had also grabbed and read my way through. So the novels were very heavily supporting me through Advanced Dungeons & Dragons by giving me more ideas of doing story-based things. Go ahead, Darryl. I've been talking for a while, so I want to make sure you get to say what you want to say about First Edition. So absolutely, please chime in.
I came into First Edition way late in the game. I came into it almost at an OSR level, which we're going to get into Old School Renaissance later. Because, I was born in 1980. I grew up in an area where D&D is Dabber. Everyone believed the chick tracks, and everyone believed mazes and monsters was real. So I didn't play a lot of D&D growing up. It wasn't until 2nd edition that I started even D&D hitting my radar. Because, like I said on many podcasts before, I came into it through this weird backdoor through Battletech and Shadowrun and HeroQuest.
Well, wasn't first edition kind of where we started to get beyond just the 4 classes as well? We started bringing in things like barbarians and cavaliers and assassins, bards.
Oh, that's when we had bards and bards.
Druids.
I really think this is where people started hating bards, was first edition when they first came out. Not because bards were bad in first edition. They were
really good.
Fucking badass in first edition.
But you had to
be
like...
But it was impossible to become a bard. You had to be a level 12 thief and then go back and train to level 8. No, I'm sorry. Fighter first, then thief, then magic user, then you started off at level 1 again as a bard.
It was a tough road to hoe, but you were kind of a badass if you were a bard.
Yeah. And the stat requirements were insane.
So this is kind of the hallmark of first edition is it starts again, it starts to really bring you out of that classic dungeon crawling team and give you more options. Monks, rangers,
Which is one of those weird things I've never quite understood why monks were ever a thing in D&D. I'm not complaining. Do not get me wrong. I'm a big fan of Shaw Brothers and all those old school kung fu movies. But the hell were they doing in a guy who... Gary Gygax was so obsessed with almost Renaissance medieval level technology that he wrote up stats for 14 different fucking pole arms.
Well, yeah, the Bohemian Ear Spoon, the Vulge, the Sarmi Glaive. We should actually mention something else too, but
why? What the hell did monks come into that?
First, I'm going to talk about monks. I have a hypothesis. It's not really an answer, but it's a hypothesis.
I'll take what I can get.
My theory is that at the time in the 70s, martial arts were big. Kung fu fighting was on number one on the track. Bruce Lee was huge. Everybody around Gary at the time was talking about martial arts. So I imagine, he was just like, because this is a cultural thing of this era, maybe I should put it in. But one thing we forgot to mention actually is Gary was incredibly influenced by Lord of the Rings. And in fact...
not if you ask him.
Well, in fact,
Gary Gygax claimed up and down that Tolkien was not an influence on D&D whatsoever at all.
They had to sue, though, to get Hobbits changed.
After Christopher
and
Tolkien
taken
sued
out.
him.
There were many things that had come over from Lord of the Rings. Baelors, Ents, and Hobbits were all part of D&D at one point and had to be litigated out.
You mean halflings, treants, and Baelors, not Balrogs, right?
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. Is like there's a clear influence. Like I said, it was so strong that it led to a lawsuit.
Yeah.
So there's that. But please go ahead. We were talking about the monk.
I was going to say the unquestionably the biggest influence on D&D in terms of fantasy authors has to be Jack Vance.
Well, Vance was an influence. I mean, let's talk about influences because in first edition we had a lot of actual novels being cited left and right. Jack Vance's Dying Earth is where the magic system came from.
Exactly. And every single person who's ever played a wizard in a first through third edition or basic game has some sort of voodoo doll to Jack Vance.
Well, that's true, but
at low levels at least.
It wasn't just Vance though, because there was
once we hit fifth, woohoo!
Well, there's also Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and Nawan. There was Michael Moorcock and all of his stuff was an obvious influence.
And of course, the Conan novels were a huge influence.
Conan novels, absolutely. All of these things were clear and present and connected intimately with Dungeons and Dragons, to the point where the Nawan gods were in the Deities and Demigods book. The Cthulhu gods were in the Deities and Demigods book.
Yeah.
Michael Moorcock's, kind of where the alignment system comes from. And there's just
Which
a lot of
alignment
little
is going to get its
links.
own entire podcast.
Yeah, but there's just an awful lot of little links to classics fantasy literature for first edition Dungeons & Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess even just the genesis of Dungeons & Dragons in itself. But we've wandered a bit afar. Is there anything else we want to talk about with first edition Dungeons & Dragons?
There was a lot of weirdness in first edition, the foremost of which I already mentioned, which was these very, very Eastern mythology-influenced monks,
Right.
which were based on, obviously, the Shaolin monks. But there was a lot of weird crap they were trying to pull in first edition when it came to a lot of stuff. And I've got to bring up Expedition to Barrier Peaks.
Right, which, spoiler alert, involves an alien ship with laser guns
And power armor.
high technology. Yeah. Well, I think here's the thing: is like D&D was blowing up at the time, right? It was just huge, and they were exploring different ways to offer role playing as an experience to people. They had, Star Frontiers. They had Boot Hill. They had freaking Gangbusters. You remember? they for some reason they thought it would be, the people really were hankering to play 1920s mobsters, so they created a role playing game for it. Unfortunately, that did not turn out to be a good move for them.
Just bad timing, because if they'd pulled that shit out now, I'd be all over it.
I still don't think it would be a huge seller. Let's put it that way. Boot Hill probably could have done really, really well if it was developed differently. But there was also Top Secret. And let's just say that they were experimenting, I think. For me, that's like where I see first edition is Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is that period of time where they were like, well, let's see what else we can do with our stuff.
And this is the thing I always bring up. Every single time I talk about first edition D&D, for some reason, Expedition to Barrier Peaks is always at the top of my mind. And on one hand, I hate that adventure, not for any mechanical reason, not for anything that they did wrong, but just because, the hell are you doing bringing space aliens into medieval fantasy? I don't want the ship from E.T. crashing into Middle-earth.
Well, let's be fair, a lot of players have fond memories of that adventure because it was different.
Saying that is the reason why I don't like it. I like the idea behind it, and that they were trying to figure out what worked and what didn't. Because, again, this was a brand new thing. No one had ever done anything like this before. They were trying to merge and meld genres that were appealing to the people who are buying the games. The same people who buy fantasy role-playing games are the same sort of people who are going 8 times to see Star Wars in the theaters.
Well, and this is kind of the thing about Barrier Peaks is that it was so unique at the time is that people, old school gamers, all you have to do is mention that and they instantly know what you're talking about. It was the adventure everyone was talking about at that time.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't like the final product from a modern perspective. I don't like Barrier Peaks.
Okay, that's fine.
Looking in context of the time period, I love Barrier Peaks because I can see what they were trying to do. They were trying to do something new and fresh and interesting. And that is one of the things that made first edition so cool, was they were trying so many things. They were throwing so much crap against the wall and seeing what stuck.
And I think, this is probably a good time to shift gears into second edition, because they tried things like this in late second edition as well, and I think it didn't, I think where Barrier Peaks succeeded, some of these later ones didn't. There was an adventure that took place entirely inside a giant lich's body, for example. And I was like, yeah, that's a gimmick I don't really care for.
I don't remember that one.
It was. I don't remember the title of it either. Maybe the listeners can correct us on all these titles we can't remember.
Yeah, please leave a comment.
Please leave a comment about these things, because we can't remember all kinds of things.
I got a shelf full of the damn things. I don't remember this one at all.
It was. I didn't care for it. It was too gimmicky. So second edition, for me, like I talked about, I started playing Advanced as soon as I could. Second edition Advanced is where I just played. This is like my junior high through early Army experience. So years and years and years of second edition I played.
Which, surprisingly enough, at least for me, born in '80, second edition came a lot later than I thought it did when I actually looked at the publication dates. The first second edition started in 1989.
Yeah, it was.
I thought it came way later than that for some reason.
And for me, that
or way earlier than that. Sorry.
That was junior high. So I started playing it in junior high, and I played it all the way through high school and all the way through college and all the way into, like I said, started playing, all the way up through the my years in the Army. So the time where I had the most free time and the most people around me with free time who were gamers was second edition. So when you talk about like my memories of D&D, like for me, almost the definition of Dungeons & Dragons is second edition advanced.
And there are a lot of people who agree with you, especially even going into my generation, because like I said, I was born in 80. 1989, 90, 91, 92, that's when we were hitting that middle school age where a lot of people get hooked on role-playing games. That's what all my friends were playing, was second edition D&D.
Yeah.
That's what really drew in a lot of the people of my age group. They didn't play first edition, they played second edition.
And how can you tell,
that's what was on the shelves.
How can you tell it's a second edition D&D product? Well, it's got a black border and a Jeff Easley cover. Those are probably the two biggest ones I can think of off the top of my head.
And they had this big, huge, complicated word because apparently they started this big censorship move after the Mazes and Monsters Jack Trick thing. No demons, no devils, no monks, no assassins.
Well, this is also, it's fair to point out that this is also a period of time for TSR that was very turbulent. It was the, what was her name? The CEO that took over, because Gary was no longer in charge.
God, you're asking me that now.
So there's this woman, and I can't remember her name.
I've got the
Lorraine.
article
It's
right
Lorraine.
Hang on.
Use the internet.
No, I've got it open.
So Lorraine was in charge.
Show me Lord of the Rings. I'm trying to find Lorraine.
And her family owned the Buck Rogers license. Yep. And this is when she was in charge of the company. And so there was a lot of things kind of going on behind the scenes in second edition that you could probably point to Lorraine's leadership of the company. And I'm not gonna make any allegations about like what she did or didn't do, but I'm going to say that
Lorraine Williams.
I'm going to say that I believe that Lorraine Williams is responsible for a lot of the changes that Darryl's talking about, like getting rid of the word demon, the word devil, getting rid of assassins.
Well, it was kind of a corporate takeover in a way from Gary. Basically, it became what happened was, toward the end of first edition, TSR was starting to get a little bit cash-strapped and needed more capital to invest back into the game because they had two game lines running. They had the advanced and they had the basic running, and both were selling kind of equally well at that point. And they needed money to print more product to sell more games. So they started bringing in investors, one of which was Lorraine Williams.
And again, I think we should just say we're not super historians, and most of this information is probably better found, Wikipedia or Shannon Appleklein's book.
Like I said, I'm going to have plenty of links in this to back up what I'm saying, but this is an aspect of D&D I'm completely fascinated with, is Williams' takeover of TSR and the downfall of TSR and Wizards of the Coast taking over.
This is exactly when that happens, is during the second edition D&D of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons.
And actually I'm going to break away from that topic for a little bit so we can talk about second edition a little bit more, and what might have contributed to that a little bit was second edition had a very, very specific design paradigm. For one thing, they really wanted to eliminate anything that might be offensive to the Christian organizations, like the 700 Club, that were constantly attacking them. And they pulled out, there were no more demons, there were no more devils, there were no more
Tannery
daemons.
And Badzu.
You remember that a hell of a lot better than I do.
Yeah, well,
I just know them as not demons and not devils.
I've been playing an awful lot of Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2, the enhanced edition.
Oh, yeah. And this is also during the rise of Usenet, by the way.
Yeah.
And the formation of the internet, which really influenced a lot of this stuff we're talking about, because the fans got a lot more direct, instant input as opposed to having to handwrite out a letter, put it in an envelope, stamp it, and mail it. Instead, you could send an email or post on the Usenet board, "This sucks!"
Well, I think it was, I believe it was Roger Moore, the editor at the time, who was kind of the guy who ultimately made the decision to change the names from Demons and Devils. And, like I said,
I'm not entirely sure who made that call, but that was a big shift. There was also a paradigm when it came to the novel writing, and I've listened to a lot of talks with Ari Salvatore, who talked about this, where they completely shifted everything from, it used to be you could do pretty much whatever you wanted as long as you stayed within the genre boundaries. And then they handed down this edict. The bad guys must always lose, cannot gain from their loss, and must be utterly defeated by the heroes. Evil can never triumph in D&D.
Wow. Yeah,
and that really crippled a lot of storytelling because the Xanatos Gambit, for God's sake.
Well, let's talk a little bit about novels too, because the second edition period of D&D,
the first to second transition is where the novels really blew up. That's where we got Dragonlance. That's where we got Salvatore and Drizzt.
Yeah, because let's there's a step back we can take even from that. Second edition is where they introduced a lot of different campaign settings.
Yes.
Forgotten Realms was probably the most impactful of all of them.
I believe it was actually the first they released.
Most likely, yeah. And the thing is that they had tons of books coming out, novels. In fact, there were so many Dragonlance novels that even a fan, passionate as myself, I gave up. I just could not.
They had 1 to 2 a month, and this will tie in later on when I start talking about the demise of TSR.
Yeah, this was a big factor. There's a thing about returned books that became a big factor.
I will get into that in a moment, but we're talking about the novels themselves. There were a lot of
not the game books, the novels.
The story novels where you could go into Barnes & Noble, Walden, at the time, Walden Books was still a thing in malls, and you could go and see them on the bestseller shelves, and there were a ton of them, and some of them were really, really, really good, and those are the ones everyone talks about, and most of them were, I'm sorry, complete and utter crap.
Well, again, no hate. You were very disappointed with most of them, that's fair to say.
It was...
all right.
I could see they were trying so hard, but because of the publication schedule and everything else going on, I can understand why they turned out as, to use Ross's word, disappointing, or to use my word, utter shit, that they were.
Send your emails to Darryl at gamerstavern.org.
Abstruse at gamerstavern.org.
There you go. Please let him know what you think of
go ahead and leave a comment on the website, gamerstavern.org. But, like I said, there were a lot of really, really, really awesome novels coming out at this time, but there was also a lot of crap, and it was because they were pushing out so many novels because it was such a good revenue stream for TSR at the time. They were hitting the boom of the... Here's the weird thing about the publication industry. And this is something I learned when I was working at the bookstore. When the economy takes a downturn, books become people's favored form of entertainment because it gives them more bang for their buck in terms of time spent versus money spent. Your average reader is going to tear through a 300-page book in between 8 to 14 hours. Or they can spend... At this point in time, $5.99 bought you a book.
How many pages did they get through in 8 to 8 hours?
300. 300. Okay. That's the average novel length, give or take 25 to 50 pages.
Well,
for this genre, when you start getting into like Wheel of Time and everything else, where you're talking about phone books, that's a completely different beast.
Well, it's also important to point out. We mentioned this just briefly, but there were this is the era of lots and lots of campaign settings. So the novels weren't just Greyhawk novels, and they weren't just Dragonlance novels, and they weren't just Forgotten Realms novels. There were Dark Sun novels, and Spelljammer novels,
and Ravenloft, and Planescape, and
Naztica, and
Birthright.
I mean, you name it. Yeah,
were there
every
Birthright
setting.
Novels? I can't remember.
What?
You would know. Were there Birthright novels?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was a whole line, and I own all of them. So there's that. And I kind of like I was disappointed with most of the Birthright novels, unfortunately.
Now it's. And like I said, it's again because the economy at that point in time in history was in a bit of a slump. It was called the recession. You heard a lot about that. If you were alive during the time, during the Reagan to Bush to Clinton transfer, the recession. It was the buzzword of the time before there were buzzwords in media. But because of that, people wanted the most bang for the buck they can get. They could buy a VHS tape for $19.99 or $29.99 or pay their, at this point in time when you wanted to get a membership fee to a video store, remember those things?
Yeah.
You had to actually pay money to get the membership fee in the first place before you could even rent the tapes for $3 or $4 a pop.
But a fantasy novel was only like $2.50 to $3.
It was, but the cover price on those books was between $3.99 and $5.99.
Well,
during
that's
this era.
Well, I'm going to say I remember them being lower, but that's again I got started earlier, so.
Well, yeah, it also depends on exactly how early you're talking about. I'm talking about the $3.99 was pretty much the minimum for anything other than serial romance and westerns once you hit about the late 80s, early 90s.
Well, okay,
anything before that, that's when you start hitting they were like $2.50, you might see a $1.95 every once in a while.
Yeah, I remember taking $10 and getting 4 books, so there
yeah.
you go. But
but it was a
enough.
big investment on time, and that's why the novels were doing so well. Then the economy started recovering, and the novel market started to tank.
Well, they'd also flooded it. I mean, it's fair to say just because they also had Buck Rogers and Gamma World, and I mean, just like everything, there was all these different things under the sun, and I think they just saturated the market with, as you say, a lot of sort of mediocre books.
This is the early 90s, I'm going to say 91, 92, 93. I was, again, 11, 12, 13 years old. I was able to, I've said this before, I grew up in a bookstore. My mother owned this bookstore from when I was 5 years old until I was 21. So I went from, putting books on shelves in numbers or numerical order or alphabetical order to, I ended up being a manager of the place. I was doing purchasing and everything else. And this is about that time I was starting to learn how the publishing world worked from the independent bookseller point of view, which, for you kids out there, independent booksellers were bookstores that weren't Amazon or Walmart or Books A Million or Barnes & Noble.
Little mom and pop shops. I remember them. There were quite a few.
I know.
Used to be. Not anymore. But used to be.
That was me trying to make a lame joke. Anyway. Anyway, we would get these trade magazines from our distributor, which at that point in time was called Ingram's, which would list all the books out, and they would do this magazine out monthly, and we would sit there and run them. If you're a comic book fan, it was very similar to the previews that you can get from your comic book store. And it was solicitations to retailers trying to convince you to stock this book. You would have between 1 to 3 per month coming from TSR via Random House at that point in time.
And I think
so much.
To make a long story short, what basically happened is there were so many books and so many of them weren't selling very well. There was a clause in the contracts for publishing where if the books don't sell well, all the bookstore really has to do is take them off the shelf, strip the cover off, and then mail it back to the publisher to get a rebate on those books. It's not a full refund, but they get some money back. And unfortunately what happened to TSR is that they just had this huge flood of books coming back that weren't sold, that weren't being sold.
This is actually a slightly different thing than stripping a book. What happened was Random House had their warehouses full of stuff. They had warehouses stacked to the brim full of Forgotten Realms and Ravenloft and all these novels that were coming out. And yeah, I'm sitting in the bookstore stripping my 1 and 2 copies. That wasn't the problem. The problem was, at this point in time, that's when the real financial crunch started to hit TSR. And that's when Lorraine Williams decided to play hardball with Random House. Listen, we have this other series, and I wish to God I could remember what the series was, but it's like licensed fiction that was targeted at girls. They were trying to push. And Random House came back and said, oh, I'm sorry, we actually have our YA group covered for girls for this age range with this license that we have through My Little Pony or Jim or Barbie or something else that was out at that time that was targeted to girls. And when Williams said, well, if you don't take these, we're going to ship them off we're going to look at some other publisher. And Random House said, okay, look at your contracts. If we have any unsold merchandise in our warehouse, we can return it for a full refund after 3 months. We're now shipping back to you $1.8 million worth of unsold books.
Yeah, we'd like a check now, please.
That's exactly what happened, and that's when TSR fell.
So
was that moment.
Let's kind of move away from the whole discussion of the novels And let's talk briefly about what the game was doing at the time, because I think most of these, gamers, they don't remember that, or they only were kind of peripherally aware of it. But for me, like, the part I remember about second edition was just the tons of different options for campaign settings, some of which blew me away in how amazing and cool they were. Some really creative campaign settings came out during this time. There was Ravenloft, and there was
Dark Sun,
Planescape. These were all really cool. Some settings came out that I wasn't really that excited about. There was Maztica, which was part of Forgotten Realms. That was sort of a Mayan Aztec thing. I didn't care for it, but they tried really hard. They pushed a whole box set for it. There was Buck Rogers of the 25th Century, which was its own role-playing game. Which, the less said about that, the better. I mean, again, I don't want no hate, but I didn't care for it.
That was, again, Williams misreading the market.
Well, she was trying to support her family's ownership of the IP. But anyway, there was Forgotten Realms was probably the big shining star of this period. Greyhawk had kind of fallen out by the wayside in second edition.
Right.
And Forgotten Realms...
By this point, everyone had forgotten Greyhawk, and everyone was focused on Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance, by which I mean Tanis Half-Elf and Drizzt.
Well, novel-wise, that's certainly true. I think, in my opinion, from my experience, Forgotten Realms quickly overtook all of them and became kind of the standard. Forgotten Realms
because
kind of
there was so much awesomeness in Forgotten Realms at that point in time.
Well, there was.
If you wanted your deep urban campaign, you had Waterdeep. If you wanted your more exploration-y thing, you could go up to Tin Towns. If you wanted something that was, they had their desert area, they had the Thrain.
They had all these kinds of things. But I think even more than that was the box set. The original box set for Forgotten Realms is called the Gray Box, and it is... if you talk about Ed Greenwood, you talk about how creative he is. He's a very creative guy. The original Gray Box set, I think, is kind of like the concentrated awesome, in my opinion.
That is my biggest regret, is I cannot get a copy of that goddamn box set.
I'm very proud to own two different versions of that particular box set.
I fucking hate you. Give me one now.
I can't.
Or you're off the podcast.
No, that's not how that works.
I know.
But it's fair to say that, in my opinion, that's where the most concentrated awesome was in that. And then it kind of got developed even more through kind of ancillary stuff, like Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2. I mean, even there was just all these sort of extra things that helped build up. Not of the least of which was, of course, the novels about Elminster and the novels about Drizzt Do'Urden, and because his adventures all took place in the Forgotten Realms. Yes. So it felt like this, unlike Greyhawk, and I'm not sure why, but unlike Greyhawk, it just felt like a world that was really speaking to a lot of gamers.
And I think the reason behind that might be there was a lot more going on that, when you're reading the novels or you're playing... When you're reading the novels, you're seeing the high-level stuff, but there was still a lot of stuff going on beneath the surface. You never felt like you were the puppet to Elminster or Drizzt. You weren't playing second fiddle to them.
Well,
in Forgotten Realms, because it was so big.
Well,
depending on the module or video game you play.
I'm going to disagree with you, Darryl. Okay, I'm going to say this. From the Gray Box set, I didn't feel like I was a puppet. But once you start bringing in Pages from the Mages, the Seven Sisters, once you start bringing in the additional content, Forgotten Realms Adventures, the hardback book, you do start to really feel that. And this is, unfortunately, I think probably one of the biggest flaws of Forgotten Realms. You do feel like there are all these super powerful NPCs that just control everything. And there's no real room for heroes to make much of a difference in that world that is presented when you kind of go outside that Gray Box. And that's my honest opinion on it.
I'm completely not going to disagree with you on that at all. I think our difference of opinion on this is solely in timing as to exactly when you start feeling overshadowed.
I started it after the Gray Box, but that's just me. So, I'm curious to hear where you think it started.
I think it started a little bit later on, closer to the end game, after Wizards of the Coast had bought out TSR.
Oh, no.
And they start putting out crap.
Oh, no. That's
when I think it started
completely
happening.
with that. I think that's much later in that period.
I'm completely not going to disagree with you on that,
All
but
right.
this is also not an era of game that I was experiencing as it happened.
Okay.
Because, again, I was born in 1980. I came in through this backwards ass sort of way.
Right.
I didn't really start getting into D&D until 3rd edition.
Okay, well let me just say this then to finish up Forgotten Realms. Although it has its flaws and it has certainly morphed into something almost unrecognizable from its original state. Forgotten Realms is still a very cool setting and still has a lot of really cool things to offer to a fantasy gamer.
And they worked very, very hard over the editions, since 3rd edition, to try to get away from that. The NPCs overshadow the PCs with varying levels of success in doing so.
I eventually want to get Rich Baker on the show to talk about Forgotten Realms because he would be great to discuss it because he kind of shepherded it through 3rd and 4th edition. Yeah. Particularly 4th edition. So it would be kind of interesting to hear from him. But let's kind of table Forgotten Realms for now and just say I have very fond memories of it in certain aspects. But I do want to talk about my personal favorite campaign setting.
And I have to say, it's actually one of my least favorite campaign settings.
Well, that's just good. It makes for good radio. But Birthright. Yeah. Birthright is my all-time favorite D&D campaign setting, and I've written a huge review of it on my blog. And I'll just, kind of paraphrase it here to say the reason why I love Birthright to death, and I love it just beyond all, is it had this unique, semi-historical, sort of classic fantasy with a lot of the high magic things sort of taken out.
I will say this about Birthright. Now, like I said, it's probably my least favorite campaign setting, but that's solely because I look at it and I say, and I looked at it before something that really would have shaped it if I had looked at it
Game
after
of Thrones.
I watched Game of Thrones and read A Song of Fire and Ice. If I would have gotten a lot more into it.
That's kind of the thing, is that Birthright is really kind of Game of Thrones before Game of Thrones.
Exactly.
It has all these elements to it where you can rule a nation, and it's got this, in my opinion, very brilliantly designed rule set that is a domain level of control.
Because it's very much about bloodlines and who's in charge and ruling kingdoms and princedoms and fiefdoms.
Well, you don't have to play it that way. You can just run Birthright as your typical, we're out adventuring and doing things. And it fully supports that with some really cool, twists and turns. I love the fact that elves are actually, considered one of the ancient enemies of mankind in Birthright.
And that might be why I didn't dig it as much, because if you've heard our Shadowrun podcast, I'm in love with elves.
Yeah, but these are not your typical Greyhawk elves either. These are like the Sidhe or the Shaleen. They call themselves the Shaleen, actually, which is very close to the Sidhe. They're more based off of almost like the Welsh legends of the Athena Sidhe. It's
and
okay.
If you're
Welsh.
To Google that,
I can't pronounce
spelled
it.
Sidhe.
Yeah. I can't pronounce it right, but in plain phonetics. What I'm talking about is the Tuatha De Danann. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, and some listener from Wales can certainly correct me. But the Tuatha De Danann is what I was thinking of when you think of Birthright Elves. But it's not just that either. There's, I'm not going to spend the whole episode talking about Birthright, but I could.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say I love Birthright. I think it's brilliant and unique and a neat way to play D&D that is very similar to its roots, but at the same time provides something new.
And if you want to skim back to our Ravenloft episode with Ari Marmel, Ross could talk about Birthright more than I can talk about Ravenloft, if that will tell you anything.
So let's ask you, Darryl, what's your favorite 2nd edition setting, if you have one?
I just mentioned it, Ravenloft.
Ravenloft.
Ravenloft down for how awesome is it that they gave DM Fiat a personification in the setting.
Wow.
I love the powers. I love the way the first movie I saw in a movie theater was Fright Night.
Yeah, I hear
that really influenced me
and
in everything.
We've
I've gone over
Ravenloft
this
pretty heavily.
So yeah, that's why I'm kind of glossing over this. But yeah, I love Ravenloft. Ravenloft was hands down my favorite setting. But one thing I do have to touch on when it comes to 2nd edition is 2 settings we've spoken about a lot, but we haven't actually discussed. One I love, one I don't love as much, to put it in Ross's terms. The one I love is Planescape.
Yeah, you can't talk about second edition and campaign settings without talking about Planescape because
it merged all this crap.
Well,
that they were. Well, I say crap in terms of general miscellaneous stuff. I don't mean it as a derogatory term. All these campaign settings they were pushing out at the time, Planescape was the. God, I'm making a pun. The spire on which all of these rested.
No, it's more than that, though. I think Planescape is special not because it connects all of them. Planescape is special because it had its own feel and flavor that was completely distinct. And I'm trying not to use the word unique, but it is unique. Completely distinct from all the other settings that are out there. Planescape had a vision. Tony DiTerlizzi did all this artwork for it. And the trade dress and covers for the game. And, I mean, I just can't explain, but it's so bizarre and so different from D&D that when you play Planescape, or when you read it even, just kind of, see those the factions and the lingo that they use in Sigil, it's brilliant.
And even the concept of the Lady of Pain is so unique to Planescape compared to every single other god is presented in D&D.
Yeah.
Because, and again, I'm pretty much completely ripping off Noah Antwaller, aka Spoony One, on this one, but the Lady of Pain is probably the most fascinating goddess in the entire D&D pantheon to me, because she does not... every single other deity gets their power through worshippers. The Lady of Pain actively punishes anyone who tries to worship her.
Yeah.
In that she will hunt you down and kill you horribly if you try to worship her.
We've got to get Spoony on the show sometime, and we got to talk about Lady of Pain. So
I'm working on it, man.
So, so Planescape is the one. What's the other one? What's the one you don't like so much?
The bad one? Space Hamsters, man. Come on.
You're talking about Spelljammer.
Yes.
Okay, Spelljammer
Space
is
hamsters
goofy.
and
Spelljammer
pirate
is
ships amongst the stars.
Hold on, Darryl. I'm going to say this. I agree with you that it is a goofy setting. There is some weird stuff that you look at and you're like, really? Because like one of the core races are basically hippo men, and they're just not very good. I mean, I never could get
hippo men.
I couldn't understand the hippo men. However, that having been said, there are things in Spelljammer that are really cool.
If you like Spelljammer, I would like to apologize now for what I'm about to say, but I have to say this. Every excuse I gave Expedition to Barrier Peaks for its weirdness, I am retracting for Spelljammer, because by this point in time, they should have known better.
Well, Spelljammer, like I said, I feel like it had some parts that were really cool. To me, I like the idea that I can take a ship and travel from one setting to another setting. And in that regard, I regard Spelljammer as what made Spelljammer really unique was that, where you were saying Planescape was the spire on which they were all built. For me, that's actually Spelljammer. I like that I could go from Dragonlance to the Forgotten Realms in my ship. So there's that. But
okay, I do have to frame my Spelljammer disappointment by saying that I really think the DM who ran Planescape for me, that sort of cosmology, probably borrowed a lot from Spelljammer and cut out all the wacky shit.
Well, it's fair to say that there is a lot of goofy stuff in Spelljammer. I agree with you on that. However, I ran a game of Spelljammer I thought was really fun. My players really enjoyed it. That does not mean that it's like objectively great. We can certainly say that it's got a lot of flaws, and I will agree with you that it has a lot of flaws. But at the same time, I know it sounds like I'm defending it, and I kind of am, because I just feel like there were some really good ideas in there that maybe the execution didn't come across real well, and I'll go ahead and agree with that the execution was deeply flawed. But I still want to say, and I think you might even agree with me, that there are some really good ideas that are sort of buried in there.
There were some good ideas that were buried in there, but most of them... Giant space hamsters flying pirate ships in the stars.
Listen, for the listeners, I'm going to say this. I think it's worth looking at and worth getting some ideas from, and it's absolutely worth trying out if it at all sounds interesting to you, because I unlike Darryl, I do feel like there's some things in there that are cool.
And I want to reiterate, this is my opinion.
Right.
This is not objective fact. If you love Spelljammer, I'm not dissing you.
Well,
You're
it's
awesome.
Also,
I don't care. It's just, it is, oh my god, it's so not for me.
Well, it was definitely a niche product.
Yes.
And it probably, it didn't help that, I mean, this is one of the things also that drove TSR under, was there were so many campaign settings.
Niche
niche after niche after niche after niche.
You could, here's the thing about that era, and this is one of the few things I remember, because this was about the time D&D really started to, oh hey, I can go behind my parents' back and play D&D. Started hitting for me was around the end of 2nd edition, when this transfer started happening from TSR to Wizards of the Coast. There was a big fracture in the fan base where it was less I play D&D and it was more I play Ravenloft, I play Forgotten Realms, I play Planescape, I play Dark Sun.
Well, it's
and
also,
that really fractured the fan base.
Let's also point out one other thing. I mean, we mentioned this in the RMR Mill episode, but also this is also the ascension of White Wolf, where it was seriously competing. It was seriously drawing some of that business away.
And again, if I sound like an idiot on this podcast talking about my interpretations at the time, I want to give you the timeline of what was going on. This is mid to late 90s. This is like 95 to 98 when this shit was going on. At this point in time, I am like neck deep in Magic the Gathering.
Which was also a thing, yeah. And they're just, TSR, it's fair to say TSR split its attention so many different ways that they were not getting a solid revenue stream from any of them.
Spelljammer and Dragon Dice, I believe, were the two games they tried to pull off, and they just fell flat on their faces.
Spellfire. Yeah, yes. Spellfire and Dragon Dice, yeah. And so let's talk about like the end of 2nd edition. They had these things called the Player's Option books that came out.
And this was, in my opinion, one of the start of what became the biggest problem with every edition thereafter, which is the bloat.
Okay, so Player's Option books, you know, my friends and I, we picked these up, and this actually this helped me on my journey to be a game designer. Now, I've talked a little bit about Champions, when Champions came out, and how the Big Blue Book of Champions got me started tinkering with rules, and I really kind of owe a lot of my game design.
And to really put this
interest
in a timeline for people, the Player's Options started coming out. This is post Shadowrun, post BattleTech. Vampire the Masquerade had just hit the shelves.
Well, it's 95-ish, you know. I mean, it's
it is.
Vampire's been out a few years at this point, but yeah.
Yeah, this is. But it's still brand new on the era, but these games are completely taking everything D&D had done at this point and breaking it down and deconstructing it and kind of trying to reconstruct what a role-playing game is.
Well,
a lot of these things, TSR was kind of scrambling to implement them onto their old system.
Well, okay, to be fair, what I'm saying is I thought Player's Options pushed me a little more towards a game designer, because they allowed you to sort of build classes from the ground up, and they allowed you to build abilities and races, and
there was so much stuff in those books.
My gaming group embraced it wholeheartedly for about a year, and I want to say we tinkered and constructed and built just about everything we possibly could out of the Player's Option books. But what we discovered, my experience at least with this, is we discovered that Player's Option books unfortunately offered us a chance to build broken stuff very easily.
This was pretty much the start. This was the break between two mentalities of Munchkin. At the time, if you tried to min-max your character, you showed up with the character, it's like, yes, I rolled this fair. Yeah, I rolled 4 18s.
Okay, well, let's
and then that happened. That was the old school Munchkin.
Well, okay, you can't.
And then this is when we started getting into what's called the character
optimization.
Character optimization is exactly where I was going. Munchkins are a different discussion.
Let's be clear. There's a difference between cheating and optimization.
They are not breaking the rules.
Right.
They're using the rules creatively.
Yeah, let's be clear about that.
Break the game.
So, but the Player's Option, I think there's a difference between character optimization and what Player's Option was doing as well, because you could build a character who was definitely better than anybody else with player's option. But I think at least the experience I had with it is that we eventually just kind of drifted back to second edition because we didn't care for. There was just almost too much. Dungeons and Dragons is almost defined by a lot of mechanics that are part and parcel of what it is. If there's no magic missile, if there's no armor class, you don't really have Dungeons and Dragons. I know I'm really reaching kind of in a different tangent here.
And this is a debate we're going to get into a little bit later when we start talking about 4th edition.
Yes,
especially.
Fair enough. But player's option, my experience with it was we just tinkered with it for a while and then we kind of abandoned it. So there's that.
And my problem is, again, this may be the Southeast Texas Golden Triangle group that I grew up in. I had a hard problem saying no to people. I wasn't really running games in 2nd edition. This became a bigger problem when I did start running games regularly, and D&D really caught my interest in 3rd edition. But player's option was the start of this, where you had so much stuff out there for player characters to use, and I hate to do the PC versus DM thing or player versus DM thing, but that's kind of where you started to get this mentality, was people would go through player's options and start pulling out this random stuff and put it in their character, and then spring it on the DM at the last minute.
Well, it's also
really hard, and it's one of those things where the DM really, really, really has to have the ability to say, no, you should have cleared that with me first, and I would have said no then.
Well, something else to keep in mind is like all of the monsters and encounters in published material wasn't really oriented for player's option characters. They were designed for that paradigm of, 2nd edition with set classes and set class abilities. And if all of a sudden I can roll Castle Ravenloft with a thief who can also cast Sunray, it's a whole new ball game. That's all I'm saying. So yeah, I can understand why it left a bad taste in your mouth. I don't consider it a high point of 2nd edition. I think the high point of 2nd edition was probably the early books and, the campaign settings and things like that.
Yeah, the campaign settings were brilliant. They were imaginative, but again, they divided the player base, which was a great move for gaming, a bad move business-wise.
So that is going to take us out of 2nd edition, going to take us out of the Lorraine Williams and into the WotC and into
3rd edition. But like I said earlier, that's going to have to wait for its own podcast when we get into the Wizards of the Coast era of D&D. But stay tuned, because the next episode of the Gamers Tavern, we're joined by Sam Stewart and Sean Patrick Fannin as we discuss what may be your New Year's resolution, getting a job in the gaming industry. If you're in the area in terms of Texas, you may be interested in Space City Con, which is in Galveston, Texas, from January 3rd through the 5th. I will be there, and you can find out more information about the convention at spacecitycon.com. Ross, however, will be in Austin, Texas, January 17th through the 19th at ChupacabraCon, which you can find out about at chupacabracon.com. And for God's sakes, no, I'm not spelling that here on the podcast. Please check the show notes, because fuck. Anyway, Ross will also be in February at GenghisCon, which is a convention he has talked about repeatedly on the podcast. It's one of his favorites. If you're in the Aurora, Colorado area through February 13th through the 16th, definitely go there and check out Ross. He's going to be running a lot of events there, and you can find out more at denvergamers.org. Now, aside from where we're going, you guys have been in contact with us very recently, and it's awesome. I love all the feedback we've been getting from the website and from Facebook and everywhere else. It's great. We love hearing from our fans. The first thing we got up here is from Dravicius, and I apologize if I mangled that pronunciation of your username, but kind of give us something to go on, maybe, and I won't butcher this as much. I'm sorry if I did, but Yeah, usernames are kind of a pain in the ass. Anyway, he or she says, Darryl, just wanted to say it's nice to hear someone who is as enthusiastic about Shadowrun as I am. I still remember the first edition rulebook at my local Crown Books, and after flipping through the book for a few minutes, I just knew I had to have it. Ever since, it's been my favorite setting and system, but unfortunately have only played a handful of games, as I always get tapped from my game group to run it, one of the problems with knowing a system/setting so well. Have you ever thought of running an actual play podcast? Okay, Devicious? Again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, I'm so sorry. Anyway, yeah, this was obviously from episode 7, which was our Shadowrun episode of the podcast, which Ross and I just completely geeked out over Shadowrun. It's probably, don't make me pick children from Gamers Tavern. I'm really impressed with all the advances we've made since then and all the upgrades and audio quality and what we've learned in terms of podcasting and editing and everything else. But I'm sorry, the Shadowrun episode's still my favorite. It's the only podcast where, for you guys to know, I'm the engineer on this show. I edit everything. I sit there and splice everything together. I'm the guy who creates these shows. In terms of, I take the raw audio and I make something listenable for you, the audience. I work like 8 hours a week listening to this over and over again to get an episode done. The Shadowrun episode is the only episode since we have started in the past 3 months where I've gone back, downloaded the episode, and listened to it again. That's how much I love the Shadowrun episode, so I'm really glad that you guys are loving it. Now, I understand that the frustration in trying to get a Shadowrun game together. Everyone around here is all about D&D, 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 and D&D. I might be able to get a Star Wars game together, but no, everyone wants to play D&D. But I love Shadowrun so much, I kind of shove it down people's throats, which isn't the best approach. But I really want to let you know it's one of the better systems for running games online through like Google Hangouts or Skype or any of these other streaming media. I'd send you to the forums over at Shadowrun.com or to dumpshock.com and see if there's an online game going on that you might want to jump into if you're just wanting to play the game instead of running it. Or you can run a game and feel free to email me, abstruse@gamerstavern.org. I might want to play in your game, but be warned, I may end up being that guy because I've read all the fucking books and I'm kind of a bitch about continuity when it comes to Shadowrun. I'm so sorry to all my Shadowrun game masters out there who've had to run games where I was playing. I am so sorry. I can't help myself. Anyway, as far as other podcasts go, I'd be lying if I said we didn't have plans for Gamers Tavern beyond the core podcast. I spent 2 months before we even launched back in October planning several different things to go along and build off this podcast. This podcast here that you're listening to was kind of the center spire for everything that I was wanting to expand into. And I'd have to say that live play podcasts are definitely high on that list. And I've just invested a huge chunk of cash in upgrading our audio equipment. So, yeah, just in the preliminary stages of everything that's going on, I really don't want to commit to anything because I don't know what's going to happen and what's not going to happen in the future. But I want you to know that I'm really trying to cut down on the editing time I'm spending on every episode so I can devote more time on these other side projects and so I can increase the quality of the show and so I can make things easier on our guests, and lots of other things that are going on. But yeah, we do plan on expanding. Live play podcasts are on the list. I'm not going to say what we're going to do because I don't want to promise something that things may come up and we may not be able to deliver. But as soon as we know something is cemented that we're going to do it, we will definitely let you know either through Facebook, Twitter, or through our website, gamerstavern.org. Okay, enough for self-promotion. Let's do a little bit of a different self-promotion on Facebook, as Andreas Schar, and again, I'm so sorry if I'm butchering that. Anyway, Andreas says, "Hey guys, just wanted to say that I love the podcast. I found the Shadowrun episode recently, which got me hooked. Ever since I've been listening to that episode, I have been listening to one episode a day, trying to make them last up until your most recent episodes. Keep up the good work." Andreas, I want to thank you very, very much for your feedback. It is great to hear from our fans. I'm glad you're loving the show. And again, it looks like our Shadowrun episode's kind of an entry vector for listeners. I hope our D&D episodes you just listened to will be just as much of an entry vector. But yeah, we love the game. We love D&D. Both of us are passionate about gaming. Insanely so. It actually came to the point where about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was feeling so burned out. I'm like, oh my god, I'm spending so much time working on this podcast about gaming and writing this column about gaming. I'm just so sick of dealing with gaming. I really need to find something to just separate from gaming. I know what, I'm going to watch episodes of Will Wheaton's Tabletop on YouTube. That was my escape from the podcast about gaming, was to watch more shows about gaming. That's how much I love this hobby. And Ross, for God's sake, this is his day job. He has made a career out of designing and creating games. So, as passionate as I am about it, he's 100 times more so. So, yeah, we're always glad anytime anyone is interested in this. So, yeah. Unfortunately for you, Andreas, you said you're trying to pace this out an episode a day, and we've only been around for about 3 months at this point, and while we've got some stuff simmering on the back burner to satiate your appetite for more Gamers Tavern, the main podcast is going to have to hold you for a little while longer, and we only release that every Thursday evening. I'm so sorry. I wish I could do more, but there's always things that get in the way. But we're really glad you're listening, we're really glad you're a fan, and we hope you keep listening. And speaking of side projects and the cooking metaphor I made earlier with the back burner thing, I don't know how many of you actually go to the site at gamerstavern.org, but I've been posting some of my cooking tips to feed all your hungry gamer friends. I've been kind of emptying the vault when it comes to my culinary treasures on the site. All my tricks and tips and secret recipes have been spewing forth on the website when it comes to, I'm really passionate about cooking. I'm a big fan of Alton Brown and Good Eats, and I really think people should be cooking at home and creating foods instead of ordering out or getting delivery, everything. It means a lot more when you make it yourself, because you know what goes into it, you take a lot more care into it, and it just, your passion can come through in the food, and that's how I feel about it. So it's my website, it's my blog, I'm going to fucking talk about it. If you don't like it, scroll past it. I'm sorry if you don't, but yeah, tough shit. I'm going to talk about it because I love food. And please check out the blog if you have any comments, or if you have any recipes of your own, or if you have any dishes you would like me to talk about, go to gamerstavern.org and let me know. So, anyway, if you'd like to comment on this episode, or read more about what's going on in the blog, please visit us at gamerstavern.org and let us know what you think. While you're there, make sure to visit our sponsors and click on the donate button to support the show. And you can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/gamerstavern, or on Twitter at gamerstavernpc, as in podcast. This podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons non-commercial, no derivatives license 3.0. I'd like to thank you for listening to the Gamers Tavern podcast, and until next time, gamers, the tavern is closed.